When Javad first invited me, I thought about what I could talk about in this series, and I wanted to choose a topic which would reflect some distinctive feature of Turkey and Turkey's economy in the region. And that's why I thought of business elites, because one thing that makes Turkey exceptional, perhaps not unique, but exceptional in the region, is the strength of its private sector. Since the end of World War II, Turkey has been on this path of private sector-based economic development. Okay? Until the 70s, it was inward-oriented development, the import substituting industrialization model. But since 1980, the economy has turned outward. There has been a good deal of emphasis on these market-oriented policies, neoliberal policies, emphasis on export orientation. And there has been a lot of growth of exports, more on that later. And you also see the private sector now not only receiving FDI, investment from abroad, but you see Turkish businesses investing abroad, typically in Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. So there is a sizable private sector, a strong, certainly in terms of the region, a strong private sector in Turkey. And in this presentation today, I want to combine that with a growing emphasis in the social sciences literature on the importance of institutions for economic development. I'm sure you are all familiar with the works of people like Douglas North, and then Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson of Harvard, and also others. And these people have been emphasizing the importance of institutions for long-term economic development, not only economic institutions, but also political institutions, like the importance of law, justice, open political systems, and so on. So what I want to do today is to assess and examine the role of the private sector in Turkey. This private sector we think is strong, relatively strong in Turkey, and what role they have played in Turkey in the improvement of these institutions. Not only economic institutions, but more generally about political institutions and the democratization process. Before I go any further, I want to say outright that my assessment is that this private sector has not played such a great role, has not played a strong role in improving Turkey's institutions. So I will talk a little bit about the evolution of the relationship between the private sector and the state, and the role of the private sector. And I also want to look at why the private sector has not been very effective in this role, and what constraints there have been. Let me begin with a little bit of history. At least in my own terms, I won't go very far. I'll begin with the 1930s. Modern Turkey inherited a weak private sector from the Ottoman era. And in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the government decided to embark on industrialization. But the private sector was weak, so the strategy adopted was state-led industrialization. At this, let's say, these founding fathers they were not the mother, they were the fathers, they thought of developing a private sector in the long term, but they were trying to do that by the state creating a private sector. And some of the patterns that were established in the 1920s, especially 1930s, about state creating rich people, businesses, private sector, those patterns never really faded. They kept on changing, but they persisted until the present. So today, well, you find, for example, private sector depending still closely on state favors, for example, bank credit. In the earlier times, in the interwar period and after World War II, the private sector depended heavily on tariff protection. Tariff protection does not exist anymore in this globalizing world, but there are other mechanisms: construction projects, state procurement, purchases, and many other mechanisms. And these mechanisms change over time depending on the economic strategy, economic model, and so on. But I think that what persists is the dependence of the private sector on state favors and state intervention. This pattern continued after World War II, as Turkey transited to a multi-party democracy. And I'm sure you're familiar with the ISI model and how the ISI model depends very heavily on state interventionism and protectionism and so on. And of course, in the ISI model, the allocation of scarce foreign exchange is key. What state decisions on to whom to allocate scarce foreign exchange played a very key role. And so the private sector was dependent on the goodwill and the interventions of the state. And say, typically private companies spent more time seeking these favors, ensuring those kinds of favors, than, let's say, improving productivity or trying to export in the international markets. Now, one key organization that emerged in this period was TÜSİAD. TÜSİAD was a voluntary association of Turkey's big business, and these were in the 1970s. These were the large-scale ISI companies producing mostly for the domestic market. And it's interesting that in this early period, supporting democracy, supporting improvements in institutional change was really not a great priority. It was rarely mentioned by TÜSİAD. The military was quite powerful. Although this was often a civilian regime, it was interrupted by military coups, and many key political questions were deferred to the military, and TÜSİAD went along with that in the 70s, and then TÜSİAD was only happy to support the military coup of 1980, the last of the formal coups. And also interesting that these businesses were really, in the 1970s, not convinced of the benefits of EU membership, because they were worried that the local industries would not be able to compete with European goods in the domestic markets. They felt they were not competitive enough yet. So, after Turkey's economy entered a new era. New era in the sense that these inward-oriented policies were pushed aside for market-oriented policies, liberalization of foreign trade, privatization. The whole Washington Consensus package. And these policies were not really led by the private sector. Private sector was not at the forefront of those policies. Rather, they were led by Turgut Özal, a technocrat who turned a politician in the 1980s. And these policies benefited from a period of military rule in the early 1980s. Okay? And again, private sector went along with that. And the private sector was really happy to let Özal lead the way. They were happy with those changes. But during this process, politicians, Özal and the party, first the military, but later Özal's party, had a lot of room to maneuver. They had a lot of autonomy. They had a lot of room for their own style of doing things. And the private sector, the big industrialists, had to live with that ultimately. The global environment after the 70s increasingly favored the private sector, and the private sector agenda gained influence, but it did not make private sector in Turkey, especially big or small business, more influential vis-a-vis the government. Private sector continued to depend on state interventionism, state favors, even though on the face of it, neoliberal policies mean less reliance, or at least in theory, neoliberal policies mean less reliance on state interventionism, more open competition, and so on. But the role of the state continued. One thing interesting did happen, one of the interesting things that happened in this new period, is that TÜSİAD began to openly favor democracy and institutional changes, institutional improvements in the 1990s. Okay? And amongst other things, they also began to support openly Turkey's membership in the European Union. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about another important development of this era, let's say this export-oriented era since 1980, and that is related to the growth of exports in Turkey. You can see here, are you able to see, or should I move to the side? Okay, so you can see that Turkey's exports were really tiny in, say, current billions of dollars, just a couple of billion dollars worth of exports in the 60s and 70s. And then they began to rise after this shift in policy in 1980. And now they stand at about $160 billion. No matter how you look at it, even if you discount for the dollar inflation and so on, this is a big change. Say, share of exports as a percentage of GDP increased from about 2 to 3% to more like 18 to 20% currently, from 2 to 3% in the 70s to 18, 20% today. And in the earlier period, in the ISI period, most of the exports continued to be agricultural products. Share of manufacturers was small, roughly 1/3 in the 1970s. But you can see most of the increase in exports has been almost all of the increase in exports since 1980 has been in manufacturers. So much so that by now, 98% of Turkey's exports are in manufacturers. Turkey obviously is not unique in this respect. There are many other countries, especially in Asian countries, which have a similar profile, similar composition of exports. Okay. And The third interesting feature of this development is the share of EU in Turkey's exports. Again, as an economic historian, I like the longue durée. You can see this over the last half century, EU, variously defined, has always had a large share in Turkey's exports. Around 50%, but since the crisis of 2007, the global crisis, this share has been declining because EU's economy has been stagnating and there is that demand from the EU has not been growing. This has implications, this pattern has implications for private sector and Turkey's economy, and I want to talk a little bit about this. The point I want to make is that a good part, not all, but some important part of this expansion in exports since 1980 came from small, medium-sized businesses across the country who were taking advantage of low wages. Okay? So there has been some spread of industrialization from the more traditional areas like the northwest of the country, Istanbul and Marmara region, to new areas where wages and costs of production were lower. Okay? And along with this, there emerged a new, let's say, generation, new wave of businesses, conservative business elites, okay, in Turkey. And this new generation of elites, I am perhaps exaggerating it a bit. Not all of them are export-oriented, but these conservative businesses are well represented in the provinces, and of course, as a result, they have more electoral power. They have more votes, so to speak, than the TÜSİAD and the big businesses whose roots go back to the 60s, 70s. And these new businesses, these conservative business elites, have supported the Justice and Development Party since even before it was founded in 2001. Not only that, but because of this this reliance on EU markets, these new business elites also favored European integration and also favored and also ultimately, you could say, convinced the Justice and Development Party leadership to pursue EU membership. Today, these new businesses, more conservative business elites, are still small in terms of the volume of business in relation to TÜSİAD and others, but they are closer to government and they are much more influential politically. So let me say a few things now about the Justice and Development Party era. For those of you who are not familiar with Turkey's politics, Justice and Development Party has been in power in Turkey since 2002, so 13 years. They've won 3 successive elections and they've been in power by themselves for 11 years now. In the earlier years, Justice and Development Party was not strong electorally. They still faced challenges from the military and the judiciary. And also the EU process was in track. Again, Turkey was formally accepted as a candidate for EU membership in 2002. And then formal negotiations for membership began in 2005. So the fact that the Justice and Development Party had not yet established itself, had not consolidated yet its rule, and the fact that the EU process was on track led them to pursue a more open strategy. The government was very much pro-business, and it was supported by all business groups. It was supported by TÜSİAD, it was supported by the new emerging business elites. And this early era witnessed a lot of improvement in economic as well as political institutions. The EU was instrumental. EU was instrumental in the improvement of political institutions, a series of things, improvements, changes in the military, created constitution and so on. But also the 2001 package that was designed by Kemal Dervish, a previous minister, together with IMF help, included a series of institutional changes that went beyond the standard Washington Consensus. Okay? These institutional changes emphasized improvements in governance, improvements, for example, in the regulatory structures, and they were often referred to as the post-Washington Consensus institutions. And so Turkey adopted this set of things with the 2001 package, and Justice and Development Party continued with the same program, and in those early years adhere those institutions. Just to give you one example, one important change was this emphasis on regulatory agencies. For example, and most critically, there was, after 1980, in the, let's say, the market fundamentalism of the 1980s, no attention was really paid to the regulation of the banking sector. And ultimately, the poor state of the banking sector contributed to the severe crisis in 2001. But after 2001, the regulation of the banking sector, banking industry, was important, was successful, and played a key role in Turkey's escape from the impact of the global crisis after 2001. Turkey did not experience the crisis of 2007 very much, because, amongst other things, its banking sector was in reasonably good shape. Okay. Okay. One can say similar things about, for example, about central bank independence and so on. One of the other things, the new components that was adopted after 2001 was central bank independence. Okay. But now I want to talk about the more recent era, AKP era. Recently, you probably know that the EU anchor is gone. Turkey's EU membership prospects have faded. If not, they have disappeared. And also, so in a way, the incentives, most immediate, the incentives for continuing with these reforms, political reforms, economic reforms, have faded. AKP also was able to defeat the military in recent years, and also began to control the judiciary, began to control the media. And there has been a pattern of growing authoritarianism. I'm sure you've heard of the Gezi protests earlier this year, and they reflect the broad pattern in Turkey's politics they are, you could say, one outcome of this pattern in recent years. Okay? And the point to relate to our theme of the role of business, private sector, the private sector has had, especially TUSIAD, has had very little influence on this turn of events. They obviously supported earlier on EU membership, but they have been helpless, and they have been mostly on the defensive in recent years as these things, as the whole environment has changed since 2005, 2006. So the question I want to ask is, what are the constraints on the private sector? On the face of it, we see a powerful private sector, more powerful than most countries in the Middle East. What are the constraints? What are the structural limitations of these businesses, TUSIAD and also others, that ultimately provide such strong room for maneuver for the politicians, for the government? And that's so that the government can basically so easily can choose to ignore, or at times can take on individuals, members of this business elite, and select them out for discrimination and so on. Now, for one thing, to come back to a theme I suggested earlier, in Turkey's economy today, the government continues to play a very central key role. Again, today is not the time for tariff protection, but for things like bank credit, for the awarding of large-scale construction projects, of procurement projects by not only by the central government, but also by local governments, big-scale energy projects, housing projects. Government has a lot of power. Government can often decide on these things. And one of the interesting things is that over the last decade, one law that was changed more often has been, than all others, has been this procurement law. They come up with a version of the law, and then government feels not entirely comfortable with its implementation. They change it again. They change it again. So, but this law ultimately regulates these auctions, government procurement, and so on. But there are mechanisms now in which the government at the highest level can say, we're not happy with the outcome, and they can find a reason to cancel the outcome of a bid or an auction, and then start the whole process again. So all those things give the government a lot of room. And in addition, as I alluded earlier, there is a lot of divisions inside the private sector. I'll begin with the divisions inside TUSIAD, this large big business organization. TUSIAD members are not unified about how they want to promote or whether they should promote democracy, EU membership, how active they should be. But even when they have been in recent years in favor of these issues, okay? But not all members feel equally strongly. They are internally divided. But there is also something else going on. There is in Turkey a growing, two things, growing rivalry within the business community between the TÜSİAD, the old established elites, and the newly emerging businesses. And there is also growing polarization in the country. At one level, this is very much a rivalry between different business groups, between the old and the new elites for more influence, okay, in terms of in terms of getting these contracts and approaching the government and so on. But also, it's also about lifestyle, degrees of conservatism, secularism, role of religion, and so on. So all of that rivalry makes it difficult for the private sector to have a united position vis-à-vis the government. And of course, you find some businesses promoting these institutional changes, some favoring democracy. The others are only too happy to find ways of compromise, ways of reaching an agreement with the government and minding their own business and getting the contracts awarded. So you find in this environment the government has a lot of room for favoritism, privileges, and the government can pick on businesses and decide on whom to award the contracts and so on. I have recently finished a book on Turkey's economic history over the last 200 years, but I find this position of the government, central position of the government, and government interventionism, as one of the recurring, persistent themes in Turkey's economic history. This goes back to the 1930s, probably not to the 19th century, but to the 1930s, and it is a recurring theme. It is these sets of institutions, to cite the institutional economics literature, have persisted. Economic policies have changed, economic models have changed, but this central role of the government and its ability to choose between different businesses, choose winners as opposed to losers, have persisted. And the fact that today the EU anchor does not exist anymore for all intents and purposes has only strengthened the government's hand. Now, just as a way of, let's say, as an epilogue, in the last few years, the Justice and Development Party has increasingly recognized that if Turkey wants to continue on this path of economic growth and reach higher levels of income, let's say in the more popular parlance of the day, to avoid the middle income trap, okay, the state has to play a more interventionist role. I would say that in the last decade, the economic policy has relied on fiscal discipline and macroeconomic stability. There is growing recognition on the part of the government, especially now that they feel they are in power for some time to come, that they need to combine this with growing interventionism to pursue industrialization, to create, say, something like a neo-developmentalist state in Turkey, with the state supporting more strongly, more openly businesses, certain kinds of sectors, and so on. I mention this just as a possibility for the future, because there are already indications of this shift. Okay, you find the government asking businesses, for example, why don't you produce Turkey's own car? Okay? That's a very popular example. Perhaps it won't be a car, but there will be some other sectors where there was the ambition to bring in more technology, more innovation content into Turkey's manufacturing industries. And there is the recognition that could come only with more state interventionism. And it looks like that would come with a combination of more state intervention and more authoritarianism. And again, my point would be that the private sector we see as perhaps amongst the strongest in the Middle East region will not play a very an important role, will only be following this government initiative in the years ahead. Okay, thank you very much.